Dr. Ben Safranski, and welcome to the second session of the Eucharist in the Bible. Today we are talking about one of the most fundamental ways in which God reaches out to humanity in the Old Testament, and really the basic way that his relationship with us is arranged. This is covenant. You've probably heard that word before. In contemporary language, it usually means something like an agreement. Probably a written one, and probably one that is important or solemn. Well, that's a good starting point for what covenant means when talking about the Old Testament. And as we're going to learn, it means a lot more than that as well. Now, great Catholic and non-Catholic scholars have been talking more and more about covenant and its importance over the last couple decades. So there is a lot to read about this if you are interested. Three names I'll mention are Scott Hahn, John Bergsma, and Gary Anderson. Those are three to look for. Scott Hahn and John Bergsma write some very accessible things, and Gary Anderson is more of a scholarly specialist, but they all write great things on covenant. So what is a biblical covenant? It is basically a formal agreement that puts two parties into a relationship that is in many ways equivalent to a family. Covenants can be made for marriages, for adoptions, and for political arrangements between different lords. So let's start by looking at the characteristics of one kind of covenant that is really important for understanding the Old Testament and ultimately for understanding the Eucharist. This is called a suzerain treaty or a vassal treaty. It is called that because it is between two parties called the suzerain, who is the more prominent or powerful party, and the vassal, who is the less powerful party. So the number one characteristic of suzerain treaties in the ancient world is that they are inherently lopsided. Typically, a suzerain treaty would be made between a lord or king, a more prominent, more powerful party, and a lesser landowner or less prominent political leader or head of a family. And one of the things that is important about these treaties is that it is always initiated by the suzerain or the greater party. Now, any agreement has terms, right? That brings us to the second characteristic of a suzerain treaty. In this case, the greater party or the suzerain promises to provide certain things to the lesser party. Typically, these would mean protection and care. Often this would mean things like military protection, protection from raiders, from violent threats, and even protection from things like famine in the form of a kind of food insurance. Now, the lesser party agrees to certain things as well. These vary widely, and we will see specifics when we start looking at covenants. Now, in any lopsided agreement, the lesser party cannot really provide as much to the greater party, right? And that's why when we talk about biblical covenants, they are more like adoptions than economic exchanges. When God offers a covenant to a human or to humanity, it is not to establish a kind of tit-for-tat relationship. It is more to establish something like a father-son relationship. A next characteristic is that there are typically consequences that we call curses if the vassal or lesser party does not fulfill their obligations. There is always a visible sign of the covenant, something to remind the parties that they have entered into this relationship, this agreement. Could think of that something like a wedding ring as a sign of the covenant of marriage. There is a solemn ratification or a solemn ceremony for making the relationship visibly official and for marking out its solemnity. This ratification includes sacrifice, generally the sacrifice of animals. And this is how we as humans mark important transitions, right? Especially newly blessed relationships, things like wedding ceremonies. Now, the biblical covenants will usually not contain every one of these elements, but some or most of them. And the basic structure is something that the Old Testament uses regularly to describe the relationship between God and Israel. We may not have noticed this before if we didn't know what we were looking for, but it is something that ancient readers of the Bible would have understood without much trouble at all. Now, to see how this works, let's look at one of the Old Testament covenants in detail. The one we're going to look at is God's covenant with Abram, later to be renamed Abraham, as we see it in Genesis chapters 12 to 15. This one is absolutely foundational because it is where God first makes a series of fundamental promises to his chosen people, promises that they will be waiting for a long time and that will be fulfilled later in Jesus Christ. So let's read the passage where God first reaches out to Abram. This is in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 to 3. Quote, "Now the Lord said to Abram, 'Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who curses you I will curse. And by you all the families of the earth shall bless themselves.'" Unquote. Now, this is just the beginning of the covenant with Abram, and we can already see three key characteristics of the suzerain treaty, or the covenant. First, the relationship is offered or initiated by the greater party, God. Spoiler alert, whenever you are in a relationship with God, you are the lesser party. Now, one of the parts of Abram's story that I like the most is the fact that the Bible tells us basically nothing about him before this passage. Just a tiny bit about his family and where he lived. In other words, God offers relationship to people not because of who they are, but because of who he is and because of his purposes for them. And that is very comforting to me. Second, God asks something of Abram, and it isn't something small. He asks Abram to leave his country and his father's house, in other words, almost everything he has ever known, and to start walking. This ends up being kind of small, though, when we see what Abram will get in return. And that is the third characteristic, the promises. Now, God makes three promises here, and we could call them in shorthand the land, the nation, and the blessing. He promises them their own special land to dwell in. This is what will come to be known as the Promised Land, and it's where the Hebrews are always trying to get back to. God also promises to take this old, sterile, childless couple and make them into a great nation. Now, this will require a little miraculous childbirth later on. And finally, God promises to make them into a blessing for all the nations. In other words, to make them a people of priests, a people who offer to God on behalf of others and communicate God's blessings to the world. Both Jews and Christians will look back on this covenant as the beginning of the chosen people of God. Before this, God had dealt with all of humanity, or he had dealt with people who represented all of humanity. An example of the first is God dealing with Adam and Eve when they're alone on the planet. An example of the second is Noah. But now God is pulling a family out of humanity to set them aside and anoint them. But when you're anointed by God, you're always anointed for something. So what are Abram and Sarai anointed for? Well, that third blessing tells us. God promises that they will be a blessing to the whole world. So the chosen people from the beginning are not set aside because they're better than everyone else or something like that, but so that God can use them to bring everyone else, to bring the whole world to himself. That's what the blessing is pointing to. So after this calling, Abram and his wife Sarai, later renamed Sarah, are trying to follow what God has asked. They are moving towards the land he has said he would give them, which is called Canaan in the early biblical sources, later biblical Israel, and which roughly coincides with modern-day Israel and Palestine. But they still have this nagging doubt. How will they start a nation when they have no children and are past normal childbearing age? Well, God's promises to them, on which he has founded this covenant, seem to be in question. From human eyes, how will those promises be fulfilled? Well, God isn't going to totally fulfill them yet, but he is going to demonstrate just how serious he is about them. Now, this happens in chapter 15, verses 1 through 21. I would encourage you to go read that carefully right now. Okay, you done? Good. So this is the famous scene where God asks Abram to number the stars in the sky. In verse 2, we see that Abram is having trouble believing in God's promise. So God asks Abram to look at the stars in the sky and promises that he will have numerous descendants. And in verse 6, we see that Abram has renewed faith in this promise. What's really amazing, though, is what God does to demonstrate the seriousness of his promises. In verses 7 to 10, he asks Abram to kill some animals. Abram is to cut the animals in half, except the birds, presumably because they're so small, and to place the halves in 2 rows so that you have a kind of walkway in the middle. Then in verses 17 and 18, we read this, quote, "When the sun had gone down and it was dark, behold, a smoking firepot and a flaming torch passed between these pieces. On that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram," unquote. What in the heck is going on here? What is up with the fire pot and the torch, and what is up with the animals cut in half? Well, if you know what you're looking for, you can see that this is a solemn ceremony for ratifying a covenant, for making it really official. Now, in a suzerain treaty ceremony, the greater party would walk between the halves of sacrificed animals, as if to say, if I don't live up to my part of the bargain, let me be cut in half like these animals. So God takes his covenants pretty seriously, doesn't he? That's what this passage really shows us. We'll see as we continue the story that covenant is very important to understanding where the Eucharist comes from. When God invites people into a new or renewed relationship with him, he does it in specific ways that they will understand. Ancient people in the Near East understood the form of a suzerain treaty. They knew that the sacrifice of animals and the ratification of the covenant by a solemn ceremony meant that God took his promises very seriously. As we continue, we will see the same things about another important event in the Old Testament, the Passover. We will also see that God might be a little more present at these events than he seems at first glance. So to recap, in Genesis chapters 12 to 15, we see a very important relationship beginning between God and his chosen people, starting with Abram and Sarai. We saw that God, as the greater party in the relationship, in the covenant, initiated it. We saw that he made promises to the lesser party. We saw that he also demanded something of the lesser party in return, even though it isn't nearly as much as God can offer to Abram. We saw that God ratified this relationship with a solemn covenant ceremony that included animal sacrifice. If we kept reading, we got just a few chapters later in Genesis, we would see the visible sign of the covenant, the visible reminder to both parties that they were in this relationship, which is the command of circumcision. That's it for this session. Please join me next time when we'll talk a little bit more about the story of Abram and Sarai. We will get into the book of Exodus and start talking about God's presence with his people, the Israelites. If you enjoyed this video, please like it, share it, subscribe to my channel, hit the bell notification, and come back for our next session. Most importantly, pray for me and I will be praying for you. Peace.